All right. Good morning. I'm assuming there's people in the audience. I can't see you because this is pre-recorded, but um, I assume that you've come back and that we haven't scared you away so far. Thank you for coming out again. I can't join you this morning in person because I'm in Australia for a conference, but I figured I'd go ahead and record this class so we wouldn't lose a week. And so we have some pretty important foundation for the second section of the class as we move forward. So I've never actually recorded in this method before, so there might be some technical problems as we go, but just bear with me. I think it'll be good, and then we can set up the second section of the class. So, if you are just joining us, we have just finished our first section of the class, which is the class is called "Is God Good?" And we explored in the first section the general problem of the pain of evil and suffering in the world, in light of a good God, especially in light of the Christian view that asserts that there is an all good and all powerful God. And one of the or not the one answer, because there is no one answer to the problem of suffering. That was one of our answers, but the Christian worldview gives us some resources and some tools to deal with the problem of pain and the problem of suffering. So we said from the Christian worldview that the Christian worldview affirms that evil and suffering are real, and that suffering has various causes. The Old Testament and the New Testament present pain and suffering, the causes of pain and suffering, in very different lights, in different passages. And we said that that's far from being a bad thing. If the Bible only gave one answer to the problem of suffering, it would feel cliche because we are very complex creatures and we live complex lives. So suffering is real, and there are many different reasons for it, and we don't always know the reason, but we do know that evil is not of God and that it will be defeated. Much of the evil exists as a function of our own free will choices. But despite this, God has suffered and died with us. So that we said that maybe if there was one answer that the Christian worldview gives to the problem of pain and suffering, is that it's not a logical answer, but it's a God's answer to suffering is that He came down and He suffered with us. And Jesus' death and resurrection serves as a decisive victory over evil, and importantly, and we will explore this in the third section of our class much more, but importantly, that redemption is coming. So Tim Keller says Christianity offers not merely a consolation, but a restoration. And I think that's really important when we talk about this topic. But as we go on into the second section of our class, we ended the first section with this question: but is the Christian worldview a coherent system? So even if pain and suffering aren't inherently incompatible, logically incompatible with God, and even if there is maybe an answer or a few answers that can deal with the problem of pain and suffering in the Christian worldview, we had to ask this question: is the Christian worldview a coherent system? In other words, does God hold to His own standards? And that's what we will talk about in this second section of the class, which I've called "Is God a Moral Monster?" This title is a hat tip to a book that is of the same title by Paul Copan, which titled "Is God a Moral Monster?", where he deals with a lot of the problem passages that we will deal with. It's a really good book. I recommend if you're looking for a book to read on this topic. It's a pretty good book, and I've listed in the resources at the end of the lesson. But section 2 will deal all with the idea of asking the question, is the God, specifically the God of the Old Testament, because that's usually where most of the criticisms come from, is the God of the Old Testament coherent with His own morals and His own values that are presented both in the Old and New Testament? And specifically, the critique becomes ever more clear when we look at Jesus and Jesus' teaching, and we ask, how can some of His seemingly very clear teachings be compatible with the actions of God presented in the Old Testament? So in the following weeks, we'll get into that much more in more detail, and we'll hit some of these harder passages. And we're not going to, I think it's most important that we don't just write off these passages, or we don't just ignore them, pretend they don't exist, or just say it doesn't really matter in the end, because these are some real problems for people when they read through the Old Testament. And I think famous, I can't remember, I don't know exactly who said it, but Richard Dawkins says something along these lines. And I think it's just a famous quote in general that something like, I was a Christian until I read the Bible, or reading the Bible has made me not be a Christian. And that it's a general sentiment that is pretty pervasive in our culture. So we want to examine that question and ask the question: does reading the Bible, and especially these problem passages, present a true problem for the Christian, and how do we deal with it? So I think we're gonna try to present a framework of understanding. And the first part of that framework is to understand the context in which the Bible was written. So this is class 6. I've titled it "Understanding the Context of Scripture and the People Who Wrote It," and really we are going to talk about mostly about the ancient Near East today. I don't know how much you have thought about or heard about the ancient Near East, but today we're going to provide a solid foundation so that we can refer back to it when we jump into the specific problems of the Old Testament as we move forward. But I said we were going to start with we're going to talk about the ancient Near East, but we're going to start with this question. And this question is, why are you so weird? If you don't think you're weird, you are. So this is an acronym that sociologists, modern sociologists, have come up with to describe a very specific subset of people that are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So basically, a lot of the people that are probably sitting in this room right now would be classified as weird. And it's this idea that came from, there was a lot of sociological experiments, and they were doing these tests on subgroups of people, and it was really convenient to do it on their classes. Like they would enroll their classes to test these psychological and sociological links, and they realized that when you take a bunch of college students from America, that their answers are very, very different than the rest of the world. And it's this idea that we live in a very unique part of history, in a unique place if you live in the West, and that we have a very unique view of the world that honestly much of the world, ancient world and modern even, doesn't share. But it seems second nature to us because it's our world, right? And I wanted to start with this because we often take our own situation and our own perspective, and then we apply that to all other situations and all other perspectives, especially in history. And that's where it really starts to get us in trouble, because it's so second nature to us to understand the world in the way that we do, that it's a lot harder for us to fathom understanding the world through the mindset of somebody in the ancient Near East, or even somebody just like 200 years ago. So 200 years ago, one of the peaks of medicine was bloodletting, or this idea that if you were sick, one of the ways that you could be sick was to basically drain some of your blood. And honestly, like we've heard about the bloodletting, and today we think that's ridiculous, right? But this only started to be questioned 200 years ago, which is not all that long ago. So technology and information is moving faster and faster every day. And as we go forward, we will see that our own perspective that we think is so intuitive and basically the pinnacle of knowledge, in 10, 20, 100 years will no longer be the pinnacle of knowledge. So we have this idea that all human societies over time have continuities and discontinuities. So like humans are in many ways are the same as they have always been, but also in many ways are very, very different. And the question is, why should we privilege our own perspective and our own time? I think C.S. Lewis famously called this chronological snobbery, where we basically believe that our time and our place is the pinnacle of knowledge, and everybody else that came before us was just not as enlightened at us as us, and we also like hold everybody in history to our own values and our own thoughts of the world, which again seems second nature to us. So why would they not feel the same way? But in 100 years or 200 years, people are going to look back at our time and think the same thing. I had a colleague in grad school who said that in 50 years they're going to look at our cancer treatments and say, I can't believe that you were poisoning people. In the same way that we look back 200 years and say, I can't believe that you put leeches on your skin to bleed yourself when you thought you were sick. Like the treatments that we have today often are rudimentary and honestly kind of poisonous. And they might look back in 50 years and say, I can't believe we did that. So when we are trying to apply our values on the people of the past, remember that people of the future will also do that to us. And it's really unfair to apply your own values to a culture that is not your own. So we must ask the question, who wrote the Bible, and how does the culture of the people who wrote the Bible affect the way we view the Bible, the way we interpret, and our whole hermeneutical model? So, in case you didn't know, the Bible came from an ancient people in an ancient land, mostly from this place that we call the ancient Near East. We usually think of the Fertile Crescent or the Mesopotamia era around 3500 to 400 BC. That's a very wide range of time, but we also must understand that before technology started moving so quickly, there was less change between people of different generations than there are today. So somebody living in the 400s AD versus compared to somebody living in the 1500s AD, probably life would be pretty similar for those two people. But somebody living in the 1500s and somebody living in the 1900s, which is a shorter amount of time, would actually have vastly different lives. And that time span is getting smaller and smaller as time progresses. But in this time, in the ancient Near East, it's a long time span, but life was pretty similar throughout that time span. Now, that's not to say that all people groups throughout that time span were the same. There were definitely differences between different people groups, and we might get into some of those going forward. But this is the time period that Israel becomes a nation, that Israel is led out of Egypt, this time period of the monarchs, of the divided kingdom, and most importantly, is the time period in which the Bible begins to be written and is finished. At least the Hebrew scriptures are largely finished by the end of this era, although there's still the process is still ongoing. That's a whole other really fun, great topic that maybe we can get into sometime. But largely ended by this era. And in the New Testament, it is written in mostly in the 1st century AD. So this is the time period that that Scripture comes from us. And if we're going to understand Scripture on its own terms, we really need to try our best to get into the mindset of an ancient Near Eastern person. So I've got a few slides here to basically give some broad outlines of what the ancient life in the ancient Near East. Obviously, this is not a comprehensive outline, but I think I'm going to hit on some stuff that will be important for us going forward when we hit some of the harder biblical passages. Some of this will serve as necessary foundation. So, life in the ancient Near East, especially compared to today, was agrarian. One scholar said that bread and beer were the staple diet in the ancient Near East, supplemented by fish, vegetables, date palms, other fruits, and on rare occasions, meat. And I just want you to like imagine how different this is from our time period now. I don't know about you, but I eat meat every meal. If if a meal does not have a piece of meat on it, I usually view it as like a snack or something. Um, and that was just so different in the ancient Near East. The majority of the diet of an ancient Near Eastern person was bread, some kind of grain. And it's because that's what you could plant, that's what was available. Um, and they ate a lot of it. And like we get the terms like breaking bread to refer to this, refer to sharing a meal together, and it comes from the idea that like bread was the main part of the meal, if not the only part of the meal, and it becomes a word that basically means meal because of that, even if you are eating other things. So, and the scholar said bread and beer because they come from the same plant, right? So that's the staple diet in the ancient Near East. Um, Also, there was famine, pestilence. They, there was a lot of disease and death, which we fortunately have, in many ways, not overcome, but lessened to some degree. But the point I want to make here is that we like to think that we are in control. We kind of feel this power of control because we have modern medicine, we have sanitary practices, we can eat all kinds of different. I mean, we can eat vegetables when it's not harvest time, right? Because we can get vegetables imported from all around the world. So we like to think that we are in control, but the ancients knew. They knew from their daily lives how much they were at the mercy of the elements and of the gods, right? In the ancient Near Eastern mindset. So they knew they weren't in control because it was always around them. Disease, death, famine, pestilence. If your crop doesn't come in, like what are you going to eat, right? So they were always ever at the mercy of the elements. So they had this, I would say, more healthy knowledge of the fact that they're just not in control. And we feel like we are. We're not, but we feel like we are. Another staple in the ancient Near East was warfare. Warfare was common, maybe even ubiquitous. And again, this is just so different than the world we live in today. It's even different than what the world was 100, 200 years ago. Warfare was a lot more common. I mean, warfare is a lot more common in other parts of the world, especially still in the Middle East today. Um, but if you live in the West, particularly if you live, which I think most of us in this audience live in America, we know of warfare and we hear of it, but it really doesn't touch our daily lives. But in the ancient Near East, like you could wake up one day and you never knew if your neighbors were going to come over and like just raid your village, raid your clan. It was a ever present idea that your whole family could be wiped out any day, even without advanced knowledge. Um, so warfare was common. City states rose and fell as kings and local rulers vied for power. So at the beginning of this era, we call it the Akkadian Empire. It's the first major empire, I think, of the world, especially of Mesopotamia. It was founded by this guy named Sargon I, who has a really interesting backstory. He was an orphan who like rose to power and overthrew the king and like consolidated all, basically made this empire from 230 34. You can see the number on the screen. So 2,334. I'm going to let you figure out how to actually say that. But anyway, Sargon I came to power. And what Sargon I did was he basically went on relentless and brutal military campaigns to establish this empire, to bring all the people around him under his control and under his rule. And really, by doing this, he established the military tradition of the ancient Near East. And he would have a huge influence on the people going forward. His successor was also a brutal warlord. And then there was this line of different kings that came along and again vied for power. Like the kingdom, it wasn't like Sargon made this huge empire and then it just stayed the same empire for a long time. Once Sargon died, there was revolts. Even during his lifetime, there were revolts. There was always this struggle for power. And kings after Sargon often tried to paint themselves in a benevolent picture, like, yeah, I'm your ruler, but I'm also taking care of you. But to be the ruler, they had to go on conquest, right? And they had to defeat people and bring people under their power, and they had to put down rebellions. So conquest and war were a way of life in the ancient Near East. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which was founded around 912 BCE through the 600s, and I know that's a pretty big gap between the 2000s to the 900s. But it's again pretty similar in this time. But the Assyrians came along, and they took brutality to a new level. They basically perfected the art of brutality and to basically scare people. And if you were in my Jonah class, you've seen these slides before. So this is about the Assyrians, or Nineveh, which was the people that Jonah hated and did not want to go preach to. And he didn't want to go to them for good reason. Assyrians were cruel and brutal people. They would come in and they would demolish their enemies. They would impale them. These are some of the reliefs or the art that the Assyrians made for themselves to show what they did to their enemies. So this detail comes from a series of reliefs found at Nineveh, in which Sennacherib, which is a king that is mentioned in the Bible, records his exploits of the invasion of Judah. So this is actually the invasion of Judah in 701. And you can see these people are being impelled on spears. They would be stretched. They had all kinds of elements of torture that the Assyrians came along to do to the people that they conquered. And it was mostly a tactic so that other people would see it and not try to fight against them. The Assyrians were known for beheading men, women, and children and piling up their heads and other body parts in different piles to show their power, and again to make sure anybody didn't go against them. So in this sense, the Assyrians were brutal, but they were similar to life in the warfare in the ancient Near East in general. There were really no rules in warfare. When you went to defeat your enemies, there was no Geneva Conventions. There was no morality behind war. You conquered them. That's what you did. So we see this idea of warfare, this constant idea of warfare. One example in the Bible is the cycle of the Judges. So here, this is just the beginning of the book of Judges. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of their raiders. And yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. And they quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's command. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was a judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies, as long as the judge lived, for the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed them and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping him, and they refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. And if you know the book of Judges, when the people do that, God gives them over to their enemies. And it goes through this cycle where they would be conquered. They would cry out to God. He would raise up a judge. It would save them. They would live free for a while. That judge would die. Then they would go back and meet doing evil, and they would get conquered again. And there's a lot of important lessons in the book of Judges. But the thing I want to draw out here is just how often Israel here was conquered and then freed and conquered and freed and conquered and freed. It just happened over and over and over. And it was the way of life in the ancient Near East. This is also reflected in the Song of Moses. This idea of warfare that is reflected here because this is right after the Red Sea, where God brings Israel out of the Red Sea. They walk through on dry ground, then he closes it up over Pharaoh. And the Moses and the people sing this song, and they say, I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted, both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him. He is my father's God, and I will exalt him. And this is the important part, which we will come back to next week, where it says, the Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea. The best of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters have covered them. They sink like the depths of a stone. Your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. And this song goes on to emphasize God's defeat over the Egyptians, and God is presented as a warrior here. And this might stand out to us as strange, but in this culture, this was like God fought for Israel and defended Israel, and God was Israel's warrior, Israel's savior. So this will be really important when we talk about violence in the Old Testament in the next couple of lessons. Something else to remember about the ancient Near East, especially in contrast to today, is that identity was thought of as very different in the ancient Near East. So they had a very communal identity. And this is still the same as in the East today, much more communal, versus in the West, we are very individualistic. We think of things in individualistic terms, which, again, I think is so second nature to us that we would not even... It's hard for us to comprehend thinking in a different way, or how someone else could not think in this way. But also, much of the ancient Near East had a shared culture and ethnicity, at least as we would think of it. So, for example, when Moses led the people out of Egypt, Exodus 12:38 says, many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. And the idea here, some translation says a mixed multitude. So when Israel, or the Hebrew people, came up out of Egypt, they actually brought a lot of people with them who were not Hebrews, who became Israel. And we think in terms of ethnicity, which has a whole history, not a great history, but the reason we think of ethnicity the way we do is because of our culture and our time and our place. Whereas in the ancient Near East, honestly, if we looked at it like a Hittite and an Israelite, I don't think we would be able to tell the difference between them. It's because they were much the same, right? And honestly, their identity was rooted less in ethnicity and more about the tribe or the clan that they came from. And membership in a tribe or clan was defined ritually. So some examples to show how this might work. So you remember Rahab the prostitute in Jericho. She saves the spies, and because of that, she gets brought out, gets saved when Jericho falls. This is Joshua 6. This says, so the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to her. And they brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. And they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men that Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. And I think that last part is really important, because she and her family becomes part of Israel, to the point where she gets included in genealogies. Another example of this is Ruth. This is the story of Ruth. So in Ruth 1, Naomi is basically saying to Ruth and her sister, go back to your people, because they had married into Israel. They had married Israelites, but then those Israelites had died, and Ruth is saying, go back to your people. And or Naomi is saying, go back to your people, sorry. So here Naomi says, look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people, and her gods go with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. And when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So here's this idea that Ruth says, no, I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to stay with you, Naomi. And she forsakes her people, her own gods, and she becomes part of Israel. She eventually marries Boaz, and their lineage leads to David. But Ruth is saying, where you go, I'll go, and your God will be my God. It's interesting, we sing a song about that, which we applied to something different, which is fine. But the words come from the mouth of Ruth, where she is changing her identity. She's saying, I am going to be a part of your people. And lest you think that this is only something that women did in the ancient Near East, it's not. So Caleb is probably one of the most famous or interesting examples. So Caleb was one of the 12 spies, one of the two that actually say good things when they get spy out the land. But it's interesting that when he is introduced, he says, no one except Caleb the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, and Joshua the son of Nun, for they follow the Lord wholeheartedly. So Caleb is presented as a Kenizzite, which is not, as best as we can know, it's probably not an Israelite. But he's still one of the 12 tribes, and he's part of Israel. And by the end of it, it says, and their names are Caleb the son of Jephunneh from the tribe of Judah. So Caleb basically becomes part of the tribe of Judah. And it's through this idea of like, you forsake your own people and you join. So you say, I am going to be a member of this tribe. So a few other things, religion and the spiritual realm in the ancient Near East. In the ancient Near East, there's not a natural or supernatural dichotomy. So all things were both natural and supernatural. The god or the gods, depending on which culture you're in, were in control of everything. If something happened, it was due to, in part, the supernatural realm had something to do with it. So there was no question as to the existence of the gods. So like the God of Israel for Israel, or the gods of the other people for the Canaanite lands, or the other people in the ancient Near East. In the Bible, we have talk of the sons of God, the Nephilim, the angels. God is often called the Lord of Hosts, and that's the idea that he commands angel armies. There's different categories for different angels and supernatural beings that we're not really going to get into here, which is super fascinating. I have some resources at the end that might help you out there. But the idea here is that this natural supernatural dichotomy is a very modern distinction, and it would not have been fathomed by the ancient Near East. So everything was part of God's world, or the God's world, and that's just the way it was. And this will become really important when we talk about the conquest and the holy wars, and the rationale behind them, because there's a very specific rationale that doesn't often come out because we don't have this worldview. We don't share the worldview of the ancient Near East necessarily. So this is an example. There are many, many examples in the Old Testament of the supernatural worldview. This is one of my favorites. This is Elisha, when the Syrian commander comes and is basically trying to figure out where his bowl is. And Elisha has prayed, open his eyes, the servant of Elisha, Lord, so that he might see. And then the Lord opened the servant's eyes and looked, and he saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. As the enemy came down toward him, Elisha prayed, Lord, strike them with blindness. So it's this great scene where Gehazi, I don't know how to pronounce his name, is fearful because this Syrian army is coming down to Elisha and him, and basically has them surrounded. And he's like, what are we going to do? And Elisha says, those with us are more than those with them. And the servant is like, maybe you're crazy. I think you're crazy. But then Elisha prays, and Gehazi's eyes are open. He just sees the whole hills surrounded with chariots of fire. And I just think that's really powerful. But it's this idea that the supernatural world, the spiritual world, plays a specific role in the natural world. There's not a dichotomy that splits them apart. So there's also a social hierarchy. It is just baked into ancient Near Eastern culture. So you had this hierarchy in Egypt. It's very similar across all the Mesopotamia and Babylon and the Syrians, where you have like the pharaoh or the king at the top. Then you have the priest or the government officials or the educated nobles, and then you have soldiers, merchants. Obviously, when you get to the lower classes, you have peasants, and then down to slaves. And this class system, it's not like a super rigid necessarily class system, but there were clear social hierarchies in the ancient Near East, and this is often reflected in Scripture. And it's important to keep in mind that this was the way that they conceptualized the world. Often we do not like to conceptualize the world this way, although I think we still kind of do in some ways. But we have like a moral reversion against it. It's largely due to values that were instituted in this world, but really did not blossom and flourish until later on. But in this world, a social hierarchy just existed, and it was accepted like we would accept an example of something that we just take for granted. To say all this, I'm not saying that ancient Israel was always exactly like their neighbors, but ancient Israel both reflected and provided a counterpoint to the culture around them. So in many ways, ancient Israel did reflect their culture. And in other ways, they provided an important counterpoint. And we will get into how they looked like the culture and how they didn't look like the culture as we go forward. But it's important that if you want to understand people's laws, you must understand their culture. It's unfair to evaluate someone's laws or someone's text with your own values and your own morals and your own culture. So if we're going to ask the question of, is the Christian system coherent, we have to understand it from the inside the world of the system, right? We can't apply the rules and the values that are not applied in the system to evaluate whether or not it's consistent. And so this is just a quick example of how understanding the context of a people can understand some what we think of as really weird laws. So Deuteronomy 22:11 says, "Do not wear clothes of wool and linen woven together." This is one of the famous critiques. It's like, why would it matter if two different clothes of two different threads are woven together? And it sounds really weird to us because we don't share their culture and their ideas. But when we start to dig in, we see that there might be some logic behind this in their culture. So Israelites wasn't supposed to wear two different threads put together, but in the ephod and the breastplate that the priest would wear, so this is the priestly garments, the command is to make it out of gold, blue, and purple, and scarlet yarns, or different threads, and fine twirled linen. And if you see here, it just reiterates that. So it seems like the ephod is actually made out of two different threads, right? The temple curtain is also, it says, make a temple curtain with 10 curtains of finely twisted linen and blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, with cherubim woven into them by a skilled worker. So we start to get this idea of, like, there's this law against wearing clothes that have these two different types of thread, but then the priest is supposed to wear clothing with two different types of thread, and the temple is made of fabric with two different types of thread. So what's going on here, really? And I pulled out this Exodus passage about the curtain is because it's a nice transition to this idea of cherubim, which we don't really know exactly what Israel thought of when they thought of cherubim, because it's not really described in Scripture. But cherubim are described in the ancient Near East all over the place. And the idea is this creature, this large creature that's a chimera, right? It has like the head of an ox, or the head of a human, or the body of a lion, or the wings of an eagle. We don't know exactly what they looked like necessarily, but we do know that they had different parts mixed together. And it seems like in this culture that the mixing of these parts what belong to the divine realm. So maybe understanding that the reason why the common people were not supposed to wear clothes of two different threads, but the priest were, is because this mixing belonged to the divine realm, and the divine realm that the priests are supposed to mediate, right? Um, I just think that's a really cool example of how understanding the culture can help us understand some laws that make no sense to us, because we don't share that view that chimeras belong to the divine realm. It's just not part of our culture. So as we go on, we're going to spend 2 weeks on the warrior god and the conquest of Canaan. So this is basically violence in the Old Testament, and how do we square that? How do we understand that? And then we'll talk about some ancient laws that don't make sense to us, that rub us the wrong way. The first one is about women, and the other one's about slavery. And so these are some of the biggest critiques of Christianity and the Christian worldview, or the Judeo-Christian worldview. So we're going to dive deep down into those topics in the upcoming weeks, and then on November 3rd we'll have our second Q&A. So I hope that you will prepare some questions for that. Here are some resources for this lesson for the ancient Near East. The Naked Bible podcast is great, especially when he deals with the Old Testament stuff. Here's the YouTube link to where he talks about the clothing of two different threads. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Bible Project. I read this a very short introduction in the Ancient Near East I forgot to put the author. I'll change that when I post the slides. But it's a really good introduction to the Ancient Near East. And of course, Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan, and also God is a Man of War by Stephen DeYoung. So that's what I have for you today. And sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I hope this was informative, and I hope it lays a good foundation as we go forward. So thank you. See you next week.